the word trauma has so much stigma because of the shame that's underneath it. And right now we're in this beautiful cracking open of the culture, of the dialogue, of the lexicon, that we are really open and willing to begin to talk about trauma in a way that isn't so loaded and isn't so shameful, and is actually really almost in many ways celebrated.
Gabrielle Bernstein, a role model for spiritual seekers.
I want to read a couple of things you wrote because they stood out to me. Gabby says, buried beneath the successful story I'd created about my life was a terrified little girl. Now you're making me emotional. Disassociated from her past, unaware of what she was running from. And then later you go into this word you use about anesthetizing your pain and how you would anesthetize it, whether it was, you know, substances or relationships or whatever they were. I just relate to all of that on such a deep level. And so maybe you could just start out by talking about that. Where did you find yourself where you had all this external success? You're admired by millions of people, yet you're going through this pain. What did the day-to-day life look like for you on the inside in your private moments?
Yeah, and I'll go into that and deeply, because one of the things that came up when I wrote this book and I made the decision to be this vulnerable is that many of the people that were closest to me, my husband, my publishers who have published me for decades, came to me and said, this is too vulnerable. And they also were blown away. They're like, we don't even know that this was going on.
Wow. Yeah.
We didn't even know that this was happening. Mm-hmm. So, and so much so that my publisher even said, you know, Gabby, we are nervous for you. Mm-hmm. You're sharing one negative story after the next, and you're not showing your true strength. Mm. But I responded and I said, my ability to be this vulnerable is my true strength.
Oh, wow. I love that.
The stories in this book, they share a story of someone who lived with a dissociated memory, a memory that from a childhood traumatic event that was completely shut down, blocked out, and anesthetized, as you said.
Yeah.
We all have that experience. Mine just happened to be extreme, very extreme. We all have that experience in extreme ways, whether it's big T trauma that we experience as children or small T trauma. Big T trauma, in my case, the experience of having something that was so extreme that I literally dissociated, that my brain just tucked it away and put it away for 30 years. Whereas for some folks, it's being bullied and having the experience of feeling like they're inadequate or not good enough, or they're separate then. So we all have these different unique moments in time that will really dictate the course of our life if they are not really processed properly in the moment.
Yeah.
For me, it was this experience. And so to answer your question, I lived for 36 years. I believe that this traumatic event probably happened when I was like 5 or 6 or around that time. I don't know all the details. So let's call it 30 years not knowing. Yeah. And in that time, I had gotten sober at 25, began a very big mission-driven career to write books, give motivational talks, be a thought leader for my generation, as Oprah Winfrey said when I was on her show at 32 years old.
Incredible.
And by the time I was 36, I probably had written at least 7 or 8 books, multiple New York Times bestsellers, had this established audience that really believed in me, had the bravery to be vulnerable and tell the truth along the way, but didn't actually know the full truth, right?
Right.
So here I was at 36. And at that time, and this is a very common thing, and it's very important for me to share if someone does think that they may have a memory that isn't fully developed. Mm-hmm. When people make big life decisions, like decision to get married or decision to change a career, decision to have a baby, or when they actually do get married and have the baby, whatever it is, those are often moments when the cracking into historical trauma may occur, whether they're aware of it or not. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot of times, one of the biggest ways that we contain the trauma is by staying in control.
Yes.
So when the control mechanisms start to get dismantled, that's when we begin to crack. And that was literally the language I was using. I kept saying I was 36 years old. I had just gotten married. We were family planning. My husband was leaving his job at JP Morgan that he'd been at for a decade to come run the business that I had built up for the past, decade. And so all of my ways of controlling my life were starting to be dismantled. So without realizing it, I started to crack. And I literally said that I'm cracking. I can't go on like this. I was having mental breakdowns. My life had been really controlled and very manic prior to that, even though there was so much good that was coming out of me. Yep. And you can still be in the pursuit of greatness and be struggling. So it's important to mention that. But at 36, here I am, I'm breaking down. I'm having massive gastrointestinal issues, panic attacks, meltdowns, like tantrums, frankly. And finally, it hit this point where I was 36 having these meltdowns, and I had a dream. In the dream, I remembered being sexually abused as a child. Yep. And then I saw myself as an adult confronting the abuse. When I woke up from that dream, I was so horrified, Ed. I was in such a terror because I woke up and it was the most real experience in a dream that I'd ever had. And it was so terrifying that I was like, no way, just shut that down. Yeah. And I pushed it down and ignored it for a few days. Days later in my therapy, opening up a little bit was enough to just blast it open. And so there I was, 36 years old, remembering this dissociated memory of being sexually abused as a child. The first few moments of this memory, I felt like, wow, okay, that explains why I was a cocaine addict. That's why it explains why I'm such a control freak. That explains why I always feel so scared in my body. That explains why I need my meditation like a pill to stay sane. Yeah. That explains why I've been on such a spiritual pursuit of happiness and well-being. And it explained so much to me, but it also put me into a very dark, scary place of being kind of stuck back in that memory.
Yeah. Can I ask you about it? I want to go a little deeper on that. So you said something earlier that's a big part of the book. And I just want to make sure everyone first off, you got to get this book, you guys. If you're walking around carrying something and you can't figure out why you're carrying it, there's one of these two T's you're carrying around, right? Like even for me, like I've produced all these external results in my life. Why am I always so worried? Why do I always create so much chaos? Why is it then for me, you talk about triggers in the book, which we'll talk about in a second, but for me, it's like, why is it that if someone's not honest with me, it affects me so much more deeply than it does somebody else? Because when my dad would drink, maybe he wasn't really honest about where he was or what he was doing. So to me, that's a trigger for me, right? If I see someone super inebriated, like out of control, it affects me so deeply when I see it because of my experience with my dad. So can you just go back just a little bit to the two T's? Because I think this is important.
Yeah. Some
people go, hey, I'm pretty sure I wasn't sexually abused. I'm pretty sure, no one beat me up when I was a child or anything like that. So I'm cool. I think people think that, right?
Totally. And, Ed, first and foremost, I just want to honor you and acknowledge you because having an alcoholic parent is big T trauma. It's capital T. Yeah. And often when we have trauma, one of the trauma responses, because there's so much shame wrapped up in the trauma. And so we have a lot of different shame responses. And one of them is to deny, is to say, oh, well, I wasn't beaten up. It wasn't that bad. I straight up would do that. I'd be like, well, I wasn't like living in poverty and like living through a war, okay, but I was still sexually abused as a child. These are serious things that occur. Yes. And we minimize our trauma because we want to minimize the shame that we carry as a result of having experienced that trauma and never processing it. So and I minimized it so much that I literally dissociated from it, told a whole other story, created a whole other world about my life that was not true. So whether it's big T or small T, and the fact that being bullied is considered small T trauma is so crazy because that's huge, right? Like that it takes people's lives. But I have seen so many people. I've been on this book tour. I've been having all these interviews, and I'll have folks like you talking to me, and they'll say, "Well, I don't really, have trauma." And then within 5 minutes, she's like, "But my dad was an alcoholic, and my mom left us, and I didn't really have a safe place to go to at home." And I'm like, "Oh my God," you know what I mean? Like people
Right.
don't. The word trauma has so much stigma because of the shame that's underneath it. And right now we're in this beautiful cracking open of the culture, of the dialogue, of the lexicon, that we are really open and willing to begin to talk about trauma in a way that isn't so loaded and isn't so shameful, and is actually really almost in many ways celebrated. When my social media manager texted me and said trauma is trending on TikTok,
Wow.
I knew we were living in a different time. I knew we were living in a different time.
Where are you sitting with this now, Gabby? In all honesty, like all the work you've done. By the way, this book's loaded with tools, and we're going to touch on a couple of them. But I also want you guys to get the book, so we'll touch on a few of them. But like as you sit there this morning, how would you describe your state of being now?
I am so proud of who I am right now. I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
At 36, when I remembered this trauma, I knew right then and there, I need to write a book about this. I need to do this. But there's no way in hell that I could put that book and that pen to paper until I had lived through the journey of undoing and returning to that place of peace. I put my face on this book cover, Ed. The subtitle is The Guided Path from Trauma to Profound Freedom and Inner Peace. It would be really, really dangerous for me to put my face on that cover and my name on that cover if I couldn't really stand behind that promise. So as a result of living the practices that we'll touch on, as a result of living through to come through the other side, and frankly, there was times where I didn't know that there was a way out. But I was committed and on a mission. And now, where am I now? I definitely am living with profound freedom and inner peace. Does that mean that I wasn't totally effing triggered about 13 minutes ago before we started this podcast?
Is that right?
No, but here's the miracle. I'm on a call.
So awesome that you admit that.
Like so freaking triggered. Okay, so I'm on a call. And the dynamic of my, I work very closely with people who are very close to me. And when the intimate relationships in your life are going to trigger you the most. So I'm on this call and my old triggers are just really there. Yeah. But the beauty is that today, as a result of particularly one of the therapies I talk about in the book, internal family systems therapy, which I've now been trained in, IFS is about really respecting all the parts of who you are. And so rather than letting that triggered part, that controller, right, that feels like she's being shut down. So the shutdown, the girl who's being silenced, right, has this protector part. And the protector part is controlling, control freak. That's like, no, let me scream louder than everybody else. Let me make sure I'm known and heard, make sure I'm the boss, blah, blah, blah. And I've set up a world that really works for that part, right?
It facilitates that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And so I'm in that moment and I'm feeling that part come up, the controller that wants to protect me from this feeling of not being seen. And instead of screaming louder and instead of pushing, I muted my Zoom because I'm like, well, even if I try to talk, they can't hear me. And I sat with the frustration and I let myself be present with the part of me that was so activated. And I noticed it in my body and I was like, I'm boiling. My face is red. I am so heightened right now. I want to punch the screen. And I asked myself, like, what do I know? I did all this in real time. Like, what do I know about this? This is the part that feels like she's not being heard. She's not being seen. And what does she need? She needs to very calmly ask the team to not put these kinds of calls in the middle of a day when she needs to be creative. And to give her more space to ideate and not force her into a decision in the way that they want.
Yes, that's so good.
And I did that. I was still triggered and I was still in that place, but I was grounded enough to say, hey guys, I need it this way. This is, and I even able to say like, this is very activating for me. And I'm feeling really frustrated at this time. And I would really like the space to be able to do this creative work in a different way.
That's so beautiful. Wow.
And and then I got on the phone with my producer and had a quick cry, and then I got on with you.
Wow. You're showing up like full out here. So I really appreciate it. I love we're a lot alike. Like I like to kind of show my fragility sometimes. Well, all the time when I do, because I don't need to be someone's, icon. I want people to believe that if I can change, they can change. Right.
Oh, yeah.
And you talk about IFS therapy in the book. There's so many things like this too, but you touched on this trigger thing and then your pattern. So let's talk a little bit about triggers and patterns, because I think even that terminology may be new to most people.
Yeah.
Right? People that have been in therapy, they're probably familiar with that. Or even if they they read some of my stuff on changing their state and being a peak performer, they know how to create a trigger and patterns. But do you feel like, so discuss that for a second, but do you feel like also like just being aware of the pattern, like what you just said, like, all right, I'm doing it again, that to some extent the awareness of the pattern can help it lose its power and grip over you?
Absolutely. And actually, that's actually one of the first that is the first exercise in the book, which is really about witnessing your triggers. How do you feel? And then what are you doing to run from them? Mm-hmm. What that's doing is, in IFS language, internal family systems therapy. It's nothing to do with family therapy, although it kind of comes from that core model, but it is based on your inner family. Inside of us, we have multiple different parts. So we have these child parts, the little boy Ed, whose dad was an alcoholic and wasn't telling the truth, and whatever the storyline is. Those little exiled parts, the little boy, he's locked up. He's like under lock and key. He's there, but he's like real down there in the dungeon. We're not talking to him. Lock him up. Yeah. And then we've got all these protector parts. I'll speak for my own, right? I've got my little girl, she's locked up, and the little girl that was abused, she's locked up. But my protector parts are the controller, the cocaine addict, right? Even though I'm in recovery, that addict part is present. The knives out is one that I call the outraged part of me that wants to be like, you mess with me, you mess with death row, like I am going to come after you. And so all these parts are very extreme and they're very protective. And often you might consider them bad habits. You might be looking at it and say, oh, that's the part of me that wants to go pick up a drink because I can't feel that, or the part of me that just wants to zone out and freeze because I can't handle this. So we have all these different protective mechanisms, but they're really in IFS called protector parts. They're not bad. These parts are very valuable. They have had a very important role in our inner system. And the role is to keep us safe from the extreme terror, shame, and fear of these exiled child parts. If you like this video and you want to get more Gabby, check out the next one right over here.